What happens when a billionaire thinks money can buy the right to humiliate others? Elena Hartwell placed the white linen apron on the cold marble table, her eyes never leaving the customer who had just pointed directly at her face while spitting venomous Italian words. Richard Thornfield, the man who owned half of Manhattan, assumed she was just an ordinary waitress, unable to understand his contemptuous remarks. But when Elena opened her mouth and responded in the pristine Italian of Florence, her voice calm yet sharp as a surgeon's blade, the entire restaurant fell silent. Subscribe for more stories where power meets its match. The crystal chandelier cast geometric shadows across the polished floors of Meridian, where the city's most powerful gathered each evening to discuss deals that could reshape skylines. Elena Hartwell adjusted her black apron and glanced at the reservation list for Table 12. Richard Thornfield. Even the name carried weight in Manhattan real estate circles. She'd seen his signature on development projects from her apartment window in Queens, towering monuments to his empire that blocked out more of the sky each year. Comment below where you're watching this unfold from. The stories of power and dignity happen everywhere. But tonight, they converged at Table 12. The familiar weight of her parents' medical bills pressed against her consciousness as she reviewed the evening's wine pairings. 6 months ago, she'd been analyzing investment portfolios for clients who moved millions with a phone call, crafting market reports that influenced decisions she now witnessed from the service side of luxury. Her father's stroke had changed everything overnight. The rehabilitation costs her mother's diabetes medications, the mounting expenses that had forced her from Wall Street back to the service industry she'd worked through college. Elena straightened the silverware at Table 15 and caught her reflection in the mirror behind the bar. 28 years old, European Studies degree from Columbia, Financial Analysis certification from Wharton. Her academic achievements had once felt like armor against the world's casual cruelties, but dignity she'd learned required no credentials and received no institutional protection. She'd mastered 4 languages, believing that understanding people meant understanding power, where it lived, how it moved, and who wielded it without conscience. Now she understood that knowledge without economic leverage was simply sophisticated witness to injustice. During her afternoon break, Elena had glanced through the Financial Times, recognizing the same market manipulation techniques she'd once documented in compliance reports. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent years writing analysis to prevent exactly the kind of regulatory circumvention she now overheard nightly in Meridian's dining room. The difference was that her old reports had gone to federal agencies with enforcement power. Her current observations dissolved into restaurant air valuable intelligence with no destination. Elena reviewed the evening's wine selection, noting that someone had confused the masculine and feminine articles for 3 different Italian regions on Meridian's menu. Small details mattered in both worlds, finance and service, but only in one did people notice your attention to them. She'd spent her morning correcting the grammatical errors, her pen moving with the same precision she'd once applied to contract analysis, finding satisfaction and accuracy, even when no one would credit her expertise. Richard Thornfield arrived at 7:45 with the punctuality of someone whose time was measured in thousands per minute. Elena watched him navigate the dining room with the calculating assessment of someone who evaluated square footage by habit and human presence by utility. His investment in Meridian gave him the kind of influence that made managers nervous and servers strategically accommodating. He wore power the way other men wore cologne, heavy and impossible to ignore. The Italian delegation followed him to Table 12, their conversation already animated in rapid Milanese dialect. Elena recognized the accent immediately. Her semester abroad in Florence had tuned her ear to regional variations with the same precision she'd once applied to detecting irregularities in financial statements. These weren't tourists discussing art museums. Their vocabulary centered on square footage zoning permits and profit margins that would reshape Lower Manhattan's residential landscape. She approached their table with the wine list, maintaining the professional composure that had served her equally well in boardrooms and dining rooms, though the power dynamics had reversed completely. With the Italians, Thornfield leaned forward, engaged and attentive. When Elena appeared with water glasses, his acknowledgement was perfunctory, the kind of functional awareness reserved for efficient machinery. The dismissal was practiced effortless and spoke to years of treating service staff as extensions of the restaurant's fixtures rather than individuals with agency. "We'll start with the Brunello di Montalcino," Thornfield announced without consulting his guests. 2015 vintage. Elena noted his pronunciation, competent but lacking the subtle regional inflection that would mark genuine fluency. He was performing Italian culture rather than understanding it the way wealthy Americans often perform sophistication by association with European luxury brands and exclusive experiences. As she returned with the Brunello, Elena positioned herself to pour from the optimal angle, a technique that happened to place her within range of their conversation's natural carry. Meridian's acoustics had been designed to contain private discussions, but Thornfield's voice projected with the confidence of someone unaccustomed to surveillance, and the Italian delegation's animated gestures suggested they felt equally secure in their linguistic privacy. Development permits expedited through city contacts. Environmental impact studies mysteriously abbreviated. Financial structures designed to minimize tax exposure while maximizing overseas investment shelter. Elena's expression remained neutral as she poured, but her financial background translated their euphemisms with uncomfortable clarity. They weren't just discussing real estate development. They were mapping the circumvention of regulations designed to protect the city's affordable housing stock. The evening progressed with a careful choreography of high-end service. Elena refilled glasses, replaced silverware, and maintained the strategic positioning that expensive restaurants demanded. Close enough for immediate response, distant enough to preserve the illusion of privacy. Her movements between kitchen and dining room created natural opportunities to overhear conversation fragments, which her linguistic training automatically assembled into coherent narrative. Their discussion had evolved from general development strategy to specific mechanisms of regulatory capture. Tax haven structures in the Cayman Islands. Consulting fees that bore no relationship to actual services. Educational opportunities for the children of planning officials whose approval timelines mysteriously accelerated for certain developers. Elena recognized the patterns from her compliance work. The same euphemistic language that transformed corruption into business development and bribery into relationship building. Thornfield's treatment of the staff grew more dismissive as the wine loosened his professional restraint and his audience expanded his sense of performance. He snapped his fingers for attention, pointed rather than speaking when he wanted something replaced, and referred to servers within earshot as "these people" when explaining to his guests how American service culture differed from European standards. Elena watched other servers' shoulders tense as his casual dehumanization spread across the dining room like a slow poison. During a brief kitchen consultation about the evening's second wine course, Marcus, the floor manager, pulled Elena aside with the nervous energy of someone delivering bad news to a star performer. "Table 12 specifically requested you for the remainder of the evening," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Apparently, Mr. Thornfield appreciates your attention to detail." The pause before those last words carried the weight of unspoken warnings. Thornfield's appreciation meant his investment in the restaurant carried expectations beyond customer service. Elena returned to table 12 with the requested Chianti Classico, her movements economical and professional. The wine transition provided a natural opportunity to refresh their setup, while Thornfield's behavior shifted toward increasingly theatrical performance for his guests. He gestured broadly when describing his latest development project, a 50-story luxury complex that would replace 4 blocks of rent-stabilized apartments in the Lower East Side. The displacement of hundreds of families was described as demographic optimization and neighborhood elevation. His Italian guests nodded approvingly, their own experience with gentrification lending credibility to strategies that transformed communities into investment portfolios. As Elena cleared the appetizer plates, she noticed how Thornfield's voice carried across the dining room when discussing his influence over city planning decisions. Other diners had begun glancing toward table 12, their conversations subdued by the casual revelation of how their city's development really functioned. Thornfield seemed energized by the attention, his voice growing louder as he described regulatory officials as reasonable people who understand reasonable arrangements. The evening was building toward something Elena could feel in the restaurant's atmosphere, a tension between Thornfield's expanding performance and the growing awareness of other guests that they were witnessing something beyond typical business discussion. His Italian guests appeared increasingly uncomfortable with his volume and indiscretion, but their financial stakes in his projects kept them professionally engaged, even as their body language suggested personal reservation about his lack of circumspection. Elena placed the evening's final wine selection before them and stepped back into her assigned professional distance, but she carried with her the weight of everything she'd witnessed. Her financial background translated their euphemisms into stark reality. Tax evasion, regulatory capture, and the systematic displacement of working families for profit margins that would never appear on public documents. Tomorrow morning, hundreds of families would wake up in apartments that Richard Thornfield was already planning to eliminate, and they would never know his name or understand the decisions being made over Brunello and Chianti that would reshape their lives forever. The following evening brought the same ritual preparation, but Elena felt the weight of yesterday's revelations pressing against her professional composure. She'd spent her sleepless hours researching Thornfield's Lower East Side project, cross-referencing public records with the financial structures she'd overheard discussed in euphemistic Italian. Her training had taught her to identify corruption on paper. Tonight, she was watching it happen in real time. Thornfield's reservation had been moved to the private dining alcove, a glass-enclosed space that provided the illusion of separation while remaining visible to the main restaurant. The alcove's curved ceiling, designed for aesthetic elegance, created an unexpected acoustic effect that reflected voices like a concert hall, making whispered conversations surprisingly audible to servers moving through the adjacent service corridor. The Italian delegation had expanded to include additional investors, their animated conversations mixing Milanese business dialect with financial terminology that transcended language barriers. Elena recognized several faces from business publications, venture capitalists whose portfolios included everything from tech startups to infrastructure development across 3 continents. As Elena arranged the alcove's table settings, she caught fragments of conversation about regulatory timelines and municipal approval processes. Thornfield was explaining how certain environmental assessments could be expedited through relationships with specific consulting firms, while building inspections followed predictable patterns when the right preliminary work had been completed. The beauty of the American system, Thornfield was saying as Elena positioned the water glasses, is that everything operates on relationships rather than rigid bureaucracy. European developers often struggle with our flexibility, but once you understand the personal elements, the process becomes remarkably efficient. Elena retreated to the kitchen to collect the evening's wine selection. The temperature of the Barolo bottle felt solid and grounding against her palm as she considered the implications of each conversation fragment. These weren't abstract case studies. They were conversations that would displace real families and reshape actual neighborhoods. When she returned with the evening's first bottle, the conversation had shifted to specific city officials and their particular areas of influence. Names were mentioned with casual familiarity, along with references to vacation properties, children's educational expenses, and consulting opportunities for spouses transitioning between careers. Elena recognized the pattern, a web of financial relationships that created obligation without technically constituting bribery. The planning commissioner's wife has been extraordinarily helpful with our environmental impact assessments, one of the Italian investors noted. Her consulting firm specializes in streamlining documentation for international development projects. Thornfield smiled approvingly, raising his glass, in acknowledgement of successful relationship building that happened to coincide with regulatory approval timelines. The curved alcove ceiling carried every word directly to Elena's position at the service station, where she maintained optimal efficiency for wine service, while involuntarily gathering evidence of systematic corruption. Her financial background provided the framework to understand exactly how these arrangements violated both federal law and basic principles of public service. As the evening progressed, Thornfield's behavior toward the restaurant staff grew increasingly performative. He snapped his fingers to summon servers, spoke about them in third person, while they stood within earshot, and made casual observations about work ethic and cultural differences that carried clear implications about class and education. American service culture requires constant management, Thornfield explained to his guests during the second course. These people understand their role, but they need clear boundaries and expectations. It's not like Europe where class distinctions are more naturally maintained. Elena felt the Barolo's weight shift in her hand as she poured the wine's deep color reflecting the restaurant's amber lighting. The discussion tightened into technical talk about permits, inspection fees, and how to accelerate them under friendly terms. Thornfield's development required coordinated approvals from multiple city agencies, each with distinct regulatory requirements and timeline expectations. His solution involved a network of consulting relationships that ensured favorable outcomes while maintaining plausible deniability. Environmental assessments typically require 6 to 8 months. Thornfield noted consulting his phone for project documentation. But with proper preliminary work, we've consistently achieved approval within 10 to 12 weeks. The key is understanding which concerns require genuine attention and which can be addressed through appropriate consultation with experienced firms. Elena refilled wine glasses and noted how the alcove's temperature had grown warmer with the evening's progression, the glass walls trapping heat and conversation in equal measure. The Italian investors' gestures had become more animated as they discussed profit projections and timeline accelerations, their enthusiasm building as Thornfield detailed his methods for transforming regulatory obstacles into manageable expenses. During a brief kitchen consultation, Marcus approached Elena with visible tension. "Mr. Thornfield specifically requested that you handle all aspects of their service tonight," he said, his professional calm barely masking personal discomfort. "He mentioned that you demonstrate the kind of attention to detail he appreciates in business relationships." Elena returned to the alcove with the second wine course, noting how Thornfield's voice had grown louder and more expansive. His Italian guests appeared increasingly uncomfortable with his volume and indiscretion. But their financial stakes maintained their professional engagement despite obvious personal reservations about his lack of circumspection. "The demographic transition is actually quite favorable from an economic development perspective," Thornfield was explaining as Elena arranged the cheese course. "Market rate conversion improves neighborhood income profiles significantly, while former residents typically relocate to areas where housing costs better match their income levels." His clinical description of family displacement carried no acknowledgement of human cost. Elena maintained her professional composure while internally processing the casual cruelty of his language. Children forced to change schools, elderly residents separated from communities they'd helped build, working families pushed further from employment centers by development projects designed to maximize profit margins for international investors who would never see the human consequences. As she cleared the final course, Elena caught Thornfield's summary of his regulatory approach. "American municipal government operates on relationship-based decision-making," he said, his voice carrying across the alcove with confident authority. "Once you understand that regulatory compliance is fundamentally about personal trust and professional accommodation, the process becomes remarkably predictable and efficient." The evening concluded with handshakes and scheduling for additional meetings, but Elena carried with her the complete picture of Thornfield's operation. Not just real estate development, but systematic regulatory capture that transformed public policy into private profit while displacing hundreds of families whose voices would never reach the planning meetings where their futures were decided. By the third evening, the atmosphere had shifted into something Elena could feel the moment she entered Meridian's dining room. Thornfield had reserved the main floor's most visible table, positioned where his conversation would naturally carry to nearby diners while maintaining the pretense of private business discussion. His body language suggested someone preparing for performance rather than consultation. The Italian delegation had been joined by additional investors from Milan and Rome, their presence transforming the evening from a business meeting into what appeared to be a celebration of successful partnership. Elena noted the expensive champagne selection and extended reservation time. Signs that Thornfield intended this evening to serve as both deal conclusion and public demonstration of his international business relationships. As Elena approached their table with the evening's champagne presentation, she observed how Thornfield's behavior had shifted from careful circumspection toward theatrical confidence. He gestured broadly when speaking, his voice projected beyond necessity, and his treatment of restaurant staff had become more dismissive and performative. "Tonight we celebrate not just successful business partnership, but the kind of international cooperation that builds cities," Thornfield announced as Elena positioned the champagne glasses. His voice carried clearly to neighboring tables where other diners had begun glancing toward his party with mixture of curiosity and discomfort. The champagne bottle felt cold and substantial in Elena's hands as she noted how his Italian guests appeared less comfortable with his volume and public visibility than during previous evenings. Their body language suggested people who preferred conducting sensitive business discussions with greater discretion, but their financial commitments kept them professionally engaged despite obvious personal reservations. As she poured the champagne, Elena caught the continuation of their conversation about regulatory timelines and approval processes. Thornfield was explaining to his newest investors how the American municipal government operated on personal relationships rather than rigid bureaucratic processes, using his Lower East Side project as a successful case study. The environmental assessment was completed in 8 weeks instead of the usual 6 months, he noted proudly, consulting his phone for specific documentation. Building inspection schedules were accommodated within our preferred construction timeline. The bubbles in each champagne glass caught the restaurant's lighting like tiny celebrations of successful corruption. During the second course, Thornfield's treatment of the restaurant staff had evolved beyond casual dismissal into active demonstration for his guests. When Elena refilled water glasses, he continued his conversation without acknowledgement, referring to service staff as examples of American cultural differences while they stood within earshot. American workers understand efficiency, but they require constant management and clear expectations, he said as Elena cleared appetizer plates. It's not like Europe where social distinctions maintain natural service standards. Here you have to be more explicit about professional boundaries and appropriate behavior. Several nearby diners had stopped their own conversations to listen, their expressions shifting from polite curiosity to visible discomfort. The conversation gradually shifted toward Thornfield's broader development portfolio and his relationships with various city officials whose cooperation had proven essential to his project timelines. Names were mentioned with casual familiarity, along with references to consulting opportunities, vacation arrangements, and educational expenses that had facilitated successful business relationships while maintaining plausible legal distance. Elena returned from the kitchen with the evening's main wine selection to find Thornfield in full performance mode, his voice carrying across the dining room as he described his approach to municipal relationship building. The planning commissioner's wife runs a consulting firm that specializes in environmental documentation for international developers, he was saying. Her expertise has been invaluable in streamlining our approval processes while ensuring full regulatory compliance. The restaurant's ambient sound had grown quieter as other diners focused their attention on Thornfield's increasingly public business discussion. Elena could feel the shift in atmosphere, elegant discretion giving way to uncomfortable awareness that they were witnessing revelations about city government that extended far beyond typical business networking. Thornfield seemed energized by the attention, his voice growing louder and more detailed as he described specific regulatory workarounds and the financial arrangements that made them possible. The beauty of American municipal government, he continued, is that everything operates on personal trust and professional accommodation. It was then that Thornfield made his fatal miscalculation. Perhaps emboldened by wine success and audience, he leaned toward his Italian guests and switched to what he assumed was the privacy of foreign language. His voice carried that particular tone of conspiratorial superiority that wealthy men adopted when discussing people they considered beneath consideration. Il servizio mediocre di questa cameriera stupida, he said, pointing directly at Elena as she poured wine, his pronunciation exaggerated with theatrical disdain. These American servers have no understanding of proper respect or professional competence. In Italy, service staff know their place and maintain appropriate deference to their betters. The words crystallized everything Elena had witnessed over 3 evenings into a moment of perfect moral clarity. The casual cruelty of his assumption, that she couldn't understand his insult, that her dignity was expendable for his entertainment, that her intelligence was invisible behind her uniform, transformed years of financial training and European education into a weapon of precision-guided professional destruction. Elena set down the wine bottle with deliberate precision, her movement drawing attention from every table within visual range. The restaurant's ambient noise faded as conversation stopped, and attention focused on the server who had suddenly become the evening's central figure. When she spoke, her voice carried the clear pronunciation of formal Italian education and the calm authority of someone who had spent years in corporate boardrooms. Mi dispiace profondamente, signore, ma il suo italiano rivela una mancanza di educazione, tanto quanto la sua condotta, she said, her accent carrying the refined tones of Florentine education. E la sua comprensione dell'etica negli affari è francamente imbarazzante per I suoi ospiti italiani. I'm deeply sorry, sir, but your Italian reveals a lack of education as much as your conduct does. And your understanding of business ethics is frankly embarrassing to your Italian guests. The silence that followed was absolute. Thornfield's face drained of color as the implications registered. Not just that she understood his insult, but that her linguistic competence suggested education and background far beyond his assumptions. His Italian guests straightened in their chairs, their expressions shifting from polite business accommodation toward genuine attention and respect for Elena's obvious fluency and cutting response. Elena continued in English, her voice maintaining the same calm authority that had served her well in financial analysis presentations. I couldn't help but notice your discussion of environmental assessment timelines and municipal approval processes, she said, addressing the entire table but focusing her attention on the Italian investors. As someone with a compliance background, I find it fascinating how consulting relationships can influence regulatory outcomes in ways that might deeply concern both American federal authorities and international investors who value ethical business practices. The restaurant had grown completely quiet, other diners openly staring, as they witnessed a server publicly challenging one of Manhattan's most powerful developers with the kind of precise professional knowledge that transformed the evening's power dynamic completely. Thornfield's mouth opened and closed without sound, his usual confidence replaced by visible panic. Furthermore, Elena continued, her voice carrying clearly across the dining room with prosecutorial precision. The displacement of 437 families through regulatory manipulation might interest federal enforcement agencies who investigate housing discrimination and municipal corruption, particularly when those arrangements involve consulting payments to officials' family members and educational expenses that create personal obligation among public servants. Thornfield finally found his voice, but it emerged as a strangled whisper. You can't. This is private conversation. His Italian guests were staring at Elena with a mixture of admiration and horror, clearly recognizing that they had just witnessed their business partner exposed by someone whose intelligence and education he had systematically underestimated and publicly insulted. Elena smiled with the calm professionalism that had made her successful in both finance and service. Nothing said in a public restaurant is truly private, Mr. Thornfield. And nothing said loudly enough for neighboring tables to overhear is protected conversation. I'm sure your Italian colleagues understand the importance of discretion in sensitive business discussions. She turned to address the investors directly in flawless Italian. Spero che le vostre future relazioni commerciali dimostrino maggiore rispetto sia per le comunità locali che per l'etica professionale. L'America merita partner internazionali che onorano I nostri valori condivisi. I hope your future business relationships demonstrate greater respect for both local communities and professional ethics. America deserves international partners who honor our shared values. The moment crystallized everything that would follow. Elena's dignity reclaimed through competence, Thornfield's power structure exposed through overconfidence, and the beginning of consequences that would reshape both their lives in ways neither had imagined possible when the evening began. The call came at 6:37 the following morning, while Elena was reviewing her parents' medication schedule and calculating how many shifts at Meridian she would need to cover the month's insulin costs. Marcus's voice carried the strained politeness of someone delivering news that would ruin multiple lives while protecting his own position within the restaurant's hierarchy. Elena, I need you to come in early today, before your shift. There's been a development regarding last night's incident. The word incident hung in the air like a euphemism designed to minimize the public exposure of systematic corruption that had unfolded in Meridian's dining room. Elena understood immediately that Thornfield's influence extended beyond real estate development into the kind of personal retaliation that powerful men deployed when their carefully constructed facades cracked in public. The subway ride to Manhattan felt different this morning, the familiar rhythm of the train wheels against tracks now carrying Elena toward an uncertain professional future rather than routine employment. She watched her reflection fragment across the tunnel's dark windows, noting how the fluorescent light made everyone look hollow and temporary, like figures caught between destinations with no guarantee of arrival. She arrived at Meridian 45 minutes later to find Marcus waiting in the manager's office, his usual confident demeanor replaced by the uncomfortable posture of someone executing orders he personally disagreed with but professionally couldn't resist. The morning light streaming through the office windows felt harsh and unforgiving, illuminating the contrast between the restaurant's elegant evening atmosphere and the cold business calculations that operated behind its polished facade. "Elena, you know I respect your work here." Marcus began, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had rehearsed this conversation multiple times. "Your language skills, your attention to detail, your professional handling of difficult situations. But last night's confrontation with Mr. Thornfield has created complications that extend beyond normal customer service disputes." He paused, consulting notes that Elena suspected had been dictated by someone with considerably more influence than a restaurant manager. Elena's breathing grew shallow as she processed Marcus's careful word choice. Confrontation suggested she had initiated conflict rather than responded to public humiliation. Complications implied that speaking truth to power created problems rather than exposing existing corruption. The entire framing transformed her defense of dignity and revelation of federal crimes into a customer service failure that threatened the restaurant's business relationships. "Mr. Thornfield has been a significant investor in Meridian since our opening 3 years ago." Marcus continued, his discomfort growing more visible as he delivered what were clearly scripted talking points. "His business relationships bring considerable revenue to our establishment, and his recommendation influences other high-profile clients who expect a certain level of discretion during their dining experiences." The pause before discretion carried the weight of everything Elena had witnessed over 3 evenings of surveillance disguised as service. Word traveled fast in Manhattan's service industry, faster than Elena had realized. By the time she left Marcus's office with her termination paperwork, 3 other restaurant managers had already received calls inquiring about her reliability and discretion with valued customers. The blacklist was elegant in its efficiency, requiring no explicit coordination. Simply the understanding that challenging powerful customers created liability that no establishment could afford to inherit. The termination process unfolded with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that Elena had observed in corporate environments when companies needed to eliminate employees who possessed inconvenient knowledge. Marcus presented her with separation paperwork that had clearly been prepared by legal counsel, complete with non-disclosure agreements and non-disparagement clauses that would prevent her from discussing her observations of customer conversations with anyone who might have regulatory authority or journalistic interest. "Your final paycheck will include 2 weeks severance pay along with compensation for unused vacation time," Marcus said, his tone suggesting this was generous consideration rather than standard legal requirement. "The non-disclosure agreement protects both you and Meridian from potential complications arising from misunderstandings about private conversations that may have been overheard during the course of your employment." Elena noted how the language transformed systematic corruption into misunderstandings and federal crimes into private conversations. She signed the paperwork with the same careful precision she had once applied to financial compliance documents, but her signature felt like acknowledgement of powerlessness rather than professional agreement. Legally, she could report the violations to federal authorities. Whistleblower protections technically existed, but power often wrote its own laws, and Thornfield's reach into the hospitality industry meant that speaking to investigators might only expand her professional exile without guaranteeing enforcement action. The mechanical click of the severance envelope seal seemed to echo as Elena walked through Meridian's dining room one final time, empty tables and chairs arranged with mathematical precision for an evening service she would never participate in again. The space that had contained her dignity's destruction now felt like a museum exhibit of her former life, beautiful and unreachable. Her apartment felt smaller when she returned, the walls seeming to press closer as the implications of unemployment settled into her consciousness. The stack of medical bills on her kitchen table represented obligations that had seemed manageable with steady restaurant income, but now loomed as insurmountable challenges to her family's stability. Her father's physical therapy sessions, her mother's diabetes medications, the rent on their modest apartment. Everything depended on income she no longer possessed. The refrigerator's steady hum filled the afternoon silence, a mechanical reminder of electrical bills and grocery expenses that would continue, regardless of her employment status. Elena opened it to find contents that would need careful rationing. Milk approaching expiration, leftover takeout that represented her last restaurant meal, condiments that suddenly seemed luxurious rather than necessary. The simple domestic space had transformed into an inventory of diminishing resources. Phone calls to potential employers yielded polite responses that grew cooler when she mentioned her previous position at Meridian. The Manhattan hospitality network operated on reputation and recommendation, and Elena's name had apparently acquired associations that made hiring managers reluctant to schedule interviews. "We'll certainly keep your resume on file," became the standard response, delivered with the kind of professional courtesy that masked permanent disqualification. The evening brought phone calls to her parents that required careful management of information and emotional tone. Her father's recovery from his stroke had been progressing steadily, but stress could trigger setbacks that would require additional medical intervention and expense. Her mother's diabetes management depended on consistent medication access and regular monitoring that became complicated when insurance coverage faced gaps or delays. Elena couldn't afford to let them understand how precarious their situation had become. "I'm exploring some new opportunities," she told her mother during their nightly check-in call, her voice maintaining the cheerful confidence that had carried her family through previous crises. "The restaurant industry is changing rapidly, and I want to make sure I'm positioned for the best possible career advancement." The lie felt necessary, but bitter, protecting her parents from worry while isolating Elena with the full weight of their financial vulnerability. Night fell across Queens with the kind of October clarity that made the Manhattan skyline visible from her apartment window, each illuminated building representing someone else's successful navigation of economic survival and professional advancement. Elena sat at her kitchen table reviewing her resume and considering how to explain her sudden departure from Meridian to potential employers without violating the non-disclosure agreement that now governed her professional references. Her European Studies degree and financial analysis certification seemed inadequate against the kind of systematic retaliation that powerful men could deploy when their carefully constructed facades cracked in public spaces. The city lights outside represented millions of people pursuing their own versions of economic survival and professional dignity. But Elena felt disconnected from that larger community of struggle and aspiration. Sleep came fitfully interrupted by calculations that refused to resolve favorably, and scenarios for explaining employment gaps to hiring managers who might not understand why someone would sacrifice economic security for principles that had no market value. Elena's principled stand had achieved moral clarity, but practical disaster, leaving her to question whether dignity was a luxury that working people could afford when family survival hung in the balance. The digital clock's red numbers marked each hour of unemployment, with mathematical precision counting down toward the financial crisis, with the reliability of compound interest. Elena's phone rang at 8:43 on Thursday morning, displaying a number with a Manhattan area code that she didn't recognize. After 3 days of fruitless job applications and the growing weight of unpaid bills arranged like barricades across her kitchen table, any call represented potential opportunity, even though her experience with unexpected calls had grown cautious since Thornfield's retaliation had demonstrated how quickly professional circumstances could deteriorate. "Ms. Hartwell, this is Dr. Nathaniel Ashford. We met briefly at a Meridian restaurant earlier this week." The voice carried a slight Italian accent, layered over precise English diction, the product of international education that had equipped him to navigate both European business culture and American regulatory environments. "I was one of the investors present during your Remarkable demonstration of linguistic competence and ethical clarity. I wonder if you might have time to discuss a potential professional opportunity." Elena felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the name and voice of one of Thornfield's Italian business partners, but his tone suggested alliance rather than confrontation. Dr. Ashford had been among the investors who had witnessed her public challenge to Thornfield's regulatory manipulation schemes, and his expression during that evening had suggested admiration rather than disapproval for her courage and competence. "I appreciate your call, Dr. Ashford." Elena responded, her fingers instinctively tightening around her coffee cup as Thornfield's name surfaced in her consciousness again. "I'm certainly interested in discussing professional opportunities, particularly given my recent career transition." She chose her words carefully, acknowledging her unemployment without admitting the retaliation that had caused it, while noting how her hand trembled slightly against the ceramic warmth. Dr. Ashford suggested they meet at a coffee shop in Midtown Manhattan neutral territory that would allow for private conversation without the surveillance implications of either his office or her apartment. Elena agreed immediately, recognizing that any legitimate employment opportunity deserved serious consideration, especially when her savings account was approaching the point where difficult family conversations about medical care postponement would become unavoidable. The coffee shop was located in a converted brownstone near Bryant Park, its atmosphere suggesting the kind of establishment where serious professionals conducted informal business without the pretense of corporate conference rooms or the visibility of high-profile restaurants. Elena arrived 15 minutes early and positioned herself at a corner table that provided clear sightlines while offering privacy for sensitive conversation, the familiar weight of professional caution settling across her shoulders. Dr. Ashford appeared precisely on time, his appearance suggesting someone who balanced European sophistication with American business practicality. Elena estimated him to be in his early 50s, with the kind of understated confidence that came from academic achievement combined with successful international business experience. His handshake was firm and respectful, and his initial small talk demonstrated genuine interest in her well-being rather than perfunctory social courtesy. "Ms. Hartwell, I must begin by apologizing for my association with Mr. Thornfield's business practices," Dr. Ashford said once they had settled with their coffee orders. Her fingers tensed again around the cup as his name entered their conversation. "Your public challenge to his ethical violations was both professionally courageous and personally illuminating for those of us who had not fully understood the extent of his regulatory manipulation schemes." His directness surprised Elena, who had expected more diplomatic language around such sensitive topics. Elena's posture remained carefully controlled while noting how Dr. Ashford's word choice acknowledged both her expertise and the legitimacy of her concerns about Thornfield's business methods. Professional courage suggested he understood the career risks she had taken, while regulatory manipulation schemes indicated he recognized the criminal nature of the activities she had exposed, rather than dismissing them as aggressive but legal business practices. "I appreciate your perspective, Dr. Ashford." Elena responded carefully, the espresso's aroma providing grounding against the uncertainty of this unexpected opportunity. "I believe that international business relationships should be built on mutual respect for local laws and ethical standards. When those principles are compromised, it damages both immediate business outcomes and long-term trust between communities and investors." Her answer demonstrated diplomatic skill while maintaining her position about the importance of regulatory compliance. Dr. Ashford nodded approvingly and leaned forward slightly, his posture suggesting he was preparing to transition from pleasantries to substantive business discussion. "Ms. Hartwell, I represent a consulting firm that specializes in international compliance and regulatory navigation for European companies seeking to establish operations in American markets. We help our clients understand not just the legal requirements but the ethical expectations that govern sustainable business relationships." Elena felt her interest sharpen as Dr. Ashford described his firm's mission and methodology. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the coffee shop's windows caught the edges of his business cards as he arranged them on the table, each movement suggesting the kind of precision that had made him successful in navigating complex international regulatory environments. "I should mention," Dr. Ashford continued, "that I formally withdrew from Mr. Thornfield's investment consortium immediately after witnessing his behavior at Meridian. My firm subsequently accepted an independent contract with the Manhattan Planning Commission to audit recent development projects, a role that requires complete separation from any potential conflicts of interest. The clarification provided Elena with the ethical framework she needed to consider his offers seriously. Dr. Ashford's withdrawal from Thornfield's projects and acceptance of municipal oversight responsibilities demonstrated exactly the kind of professional integrity that she had sought to defend during her confrontation at Meridian. Our clients include established European firms seeking American market entry, as well as American companies planning international expansion. Dr. Ashford continued, his tone becoming more specific and direct. But we've encountered increasing demand for specialists who understand both regulatory frameworks and cultural expectations, particularly from clients who have been burned by previous consulting relationships that prioritize shortcuts over sustainable compliance strategies. The implication was clear. Dr. Ashford's firm had encountered other clients who had been damaged by consultants like Thornfield who promised regulatory shortcuts that ultimately created legal liability and reputational damage for companies seeking legitimate international business relationships. Elena's public challenge to such practices had demonstrated exactly the kind of ethical framework that responsible consulting required. What we need, Dr. Ashford said, consulting his phone for specific project details, is someone with your combination of technical knowledge, linguistic competence, and demonstrated commitment to ethical standards. Someone who can help our clients navigate complex regulatory environments while maintaining the kind of integrity that protects long-term business relationships and community trust. Street noise from Madison Avenue filtered through the coffee shop's windows. Taxi horns, construction equipment, the steady rhythm of pedestrian traffic that represented Manhattan's relentless economic activity. Elena found herself calculating not just the salary implications of Dr. Ashford's offer, but the professional redemption it represented after 3 days of employment rejection and financial anxiety. Dr. Ashford, I'm very interested in learning more about this opportunity, Elena said, allowing her enthusiasm to show while maintaining professional restraint. My experience with regulatory compliance, combined with my linguistic background and recent first-hand observation of how ethical violations damage business relationships, seems well suited to the kind of consulting work you're describing. The conversation gradually shifted from general opportunity discussion toward specific position details and immediate project needs. Dr. Ashford's firm had been retained by the Manhattan Planning Commission to conduct an independent audit of recent development projects, specifically focusing on regulatory compliance and the identification of any procedural irregularities that might require additional investigation or corrective action. Elena felt a surge of satisfaction as she realized the implications. The same regulatory authorities that Thornfield had manipulated through his network of consulting relationships and personal obligations were now seeking independent analysis of his projects from consultants with demonstrated commitment to ethical standards. Her public challenge to his corruption hadn't just cost her a restaurant job. It had established her reputation as someone with both the competence and courage to identify and expose systematic regulatory violations. The position would begin immediately. Dr. Ashford noted papers sliding across the table as he consulted scheduling details. We're operating under accelerated timelines due to municipal concerns about several recent development projects, and we need someone who can begin contributing to our analysis while learning our specific methodologies and client protocols. Elena accepted the position immediately, recognizing that hesitation might suggest uncertainty about her commitment or competence, while Dr. Ashford's offer represented not just employment, but professional vindication for her principled stand against corruption. The irony wasn't lost on her. Thornfield's retaliation had eliminated her from service industry work, just as his business practices were creating demand for exactly her combination of skills and ethical standards in the consulting sector. The afternoon concluded with paperwork completion and scheduling for the following Monday's orientation, but Elena left the coffee shop feeling like she had stepped through a doorway into a different life entirely. Her unemployment crisis had lasted less than a week, transforming from financial disaster into career advancement that aligned her professional circumstances with her educational background and personal values, for the first time since her father's stroke had forced her into survival mode. The subway ride back to Queens carried her through the same tunnels that had reflected her isolation just days earlier. But now the underground passages felt like arteries of possibility rather than corridors of exile. Elena's principled stand had ultimately created opportunities rather than simply imposing costs, though the path between courage and vindication had required faith that ethical business practices retained market value despite the apparent success of corruption. That evening's phone call to her parents carried genuine optimism for the first time in months. Elena could honestly report career advancement and increased financial stability without having to maintain the careful emotional management that had characterized her communications since losing her position at Meridian. Her father's recovery could continue without insurance gaps, her mother's medications would remain consistently available, and Elena's own professional development could resume its upward trajectory toward work that honored both her expertise and her principles. 3 weeks into her position at Ashford International Consulting, Elena had established herself as the firm's most meticulous analyst of regulatory compliance patterns. Her desk overlooked Madison Avenue from the 32nd floor, providing views of Manhattan buildings whose development projects she was now investigating for municipal violations. The Manhattan Planning Commission had provided unprecedented access to internal documentation, email communications timeline comparisons, and financial records that revealed systematic regulatory capture disguised as legitimate consulting. Elena's financial analysis background proved invaluable for tracing Thornfield's complex web of consulting fees, expedited approvals, and regulatory shortcuts, while her European studies training helped decode the international investment structures that made domestic corruption profitable for overseas partners. Her compliance expertise allowed her to identify violation patterns in environmental assessments, building inspections, and zoning approvals that characterized his entire business model. Elena was reviewing environmental impact assessments for Thornfield's Lower East Side project when her computer displayed an email from Richard Thornfield himself. The subject line read, "Professional courtesy and mutual understanding," and the message positioned him as a helpful industry expert offering clarification for her analysis rather than acknowledging their previous confrontation or his role as investigation subject. She forwarded the email to Dr. Shane Ashford, who appeared at her desk within 15 minutes. "This is perfect timing," he said. "We've been looking for an opportunity to conduct direct interviews with key development figures, and Mr. Thornfield's offer provides exactly the voluntary cooperation that strengthens our investigative credibility. But we need proper documentation and witness protocols." Dr. Ashford suggested they arrange the meeting at their offices with full recording equipment and additional staff present. Elena agreed enthusiastically, recognizing that a recorded interview could provide direct testimony that transformed circumstantial evidence into prosecutorial certainty. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 2 o'clock. Elena spent the intervening days organizing her documentation into presentation format, creating visual timelines that demonstrated correlation between Thornfield's consulting payments and accelerated approval schedules. The evidence was overwhelming, but she wanted Thornfield to provide his own explanation for the patterns. Thursday afternoon arrived with crisp October weather. Elena positioned herself in Ashford's main conference room 30 minutes early, testing the recording equipment that would capture Thornfield's voluntary statements about his business practices and regulatory relationships. Thornfield arrived precisely on time with a nervous associate, notably without legal counsel. This suggested he either didn't understand the investigative nature of the meeting or believed his influence provided sufficient protection against legal consequences. "Ms. Hartwell, thank you for accommodating this meeting," Thornfield began with confident charm. "I believe there may have been some misunderstandings about standard industry practices, and I'm hopeful that direct dialogue can provide clarity about how experienced developers work within regulatory frameworks to achieve efficient project timelines." Elena maintained professional composure, while noting how his language framed systematic corruption as standard practices and regulatory manipulation as efficient timelines. "Mr. Thornfield, we appreciate your willingness to provide context. Could you explain how your firm achieves environmental assessment approvals in 8 weeks compared to the typical 6-month timeline?" Thornfield's expression brightened as he launched into what appeared to be a rehearsed explanation. The key is understanding that regulatory compliance isn't just about meeting minimum requirements. It's about building relationships with the right consulting firms and regulatory experts who can streamline documentation through proper preliminary work and stakeholder engagement. Could you be more specific about these consulting relationships? Elena asked, referring to her timeline documentation. Our analysis shows substantial payments to firms owned by family members of regulatory officials. Thornfield leaned forward enthusiastically, convinced he was demonstrating business acumen rather than confessing federal crimes. That's exactly the strategic thinking that separates successful developers from those who struggle with bureaucratic delays. When you identify consultants who have established relationships with regulatory agencies, you're investing in expertise that can navigate approval processes more efficiently. Elena exchanged glances with Dr. Ashford, who was taking detailed notes. Thornfield was providing exactly the recorded admissions that would eliminate any possibility of claiming ignorance about regulatory violations. The interview continued for 90 minutes, with Thornfield growing increasingly expansive as he described methods for expediting building inspections, environmental assessments, and zoning approvals through strategic consulting relationships. Each explanation provided additional evidence of regulatory capture while demonstrating his complete confidence that such practices represented legitimate business development. Our analysis indicates that your projects have displaced approximately 437 families from rent-stabilized housing, Elena noted. How do you address community concerns about gentrification? Thornfield's response revealed the callous calculation behind his schemes. Demographic transition is inevitable with neighborhood improvement and economic development. Former residents relocate to areas where housing costs better match their income levels, while new residents contribute to increased tax revenue. It's basic economic development theory. The meeting concluded with Thornfield expressing satisfaction about clarifying misunderstandings, apparently convinced his explanations had demonstrated competence rather than providing recorded evidence of federal crimes. By the time he finished, Elena had every admission she needed. After Thornfield departed, Dr. Ashford and Elena reviewed the recorded interview, identifying the most incriminating statements for their final investigation report. Thornfield had voluntarily confessed to regulatory manipulation, influence peddling, and systematic circumvention of environmental protection laws while demonstrating complete indifference to community displacement. This interview provides exactly the direct testimony that transforms technical violations into prosecutorial certainty, Dr. Ashford noted. Mr. Thornfield's recorded statements eliminate any possibility of claiming ignorance about the violations your analysis has documented. Elena felt profound satisfaction realizing that her principled stand at Meridian had led to this moment of investigative vindication. Thornfield's retaliation had eliminated her from service work, just as his overconfidence was creating the evidence that would eliminate his freedom to continue corrupting municipal processes. The federal investigation moved with methodical precision that Elena associated with regulatory enforcement actions possessing overwhelming evidence and political support. Within 2 weeks of Dr. Ashford's firm submitting their comprehensive report, the SEC focused on securities fraud. The Manhattan DA investigated municipal corruption, while the FBI examined potential money laundering through offshore financial structures. Elena monitored progress through legal news websites, noting each agency's targeted approach to different violation elements. The first public indication appeared in a Wall Street Journal headline she read during her morning coffee routine. Manhattan developer faces federal investigation for alleged municipal corruption. The article included details Elena recognized from her own compliance analysis. Her phone rang that afternoon while reviewing environmental assessments for another problematic project. Richard Thornfield was calling directly, his usual confident charm replaced by obvious desperation. Ms. Hartwell, I believe there have been serious misunderstandings about our previous conversations. Thornfield began, his voice lacking its usual authority. I'm hoping we can arrange a private meeting to discuss how certain statements might have been taken out of context and perhaps reach some mutual understanding about appropriate interpretation of standard business practices. Elena listened carefully while taking notes, recognizing either intimidation attempt or damage control plea. Mr. Thornfield, I believe any communication about ongoing regulatory matters, should be directed through appropriate legal channels. She responded, consulting protocols Dr. Ashford had established. My professional obligations require me to maintain appropriate boundaries between analytical work and direct communication with review subjects. Thornfield's voice became more urgent. Ms. Hartwell, you need to understand that federal investigations can be extremely disruptive to legitimate business operations. Perhaps there's a way to provide additional context that would help agencies understand the complexity of municipal approval processes. Elena recognized this as a negotiation attempt to minimize investigation impact through revised statements or alternative interpretations of his recorded admission. Mr. Thornfield, I believe the appropriate response to regulatory inquiries is full cooperation with investigating agencies and compliance with all legal requirements, she said, documenting his outreach for reporting to Dr. Ashford. The call ended abruptly, leaving Elena with the impression that Thornfield faced legal pressures extending beyond his ability to manage through influence peddling. His direct contact attempt suggested his usual methods for controlling regulatory scrutiny were proving inadequate against federal enforcement agencies. 2 weeks later, the New York Times published a detailed investigation of Thornfield's business practices, relying heavily on Elena's financial analysis and regulatory timeline documentation. How a Manhattan developer gamed city approvals through consulting schemes, provided comprehensive public exposure that would eliminate any possibility of containing reputational damage. The article included quotes from municipal officials acknowledging concerns about approval processes, along with statements from displaced residents whose families had been forced from rent-stabilized housing through developments that violated environmental laws and affordable housing requirements. Elena felt profound satisfaction reading testimony from people whose voices had been silenced by corruption but were now central to public accountability. The most significant development came through Dr. Ashford, who had been contacted by attorneys representing Thornfield's business interests. Facing federal criminal charges, civil liability for securities fraud, and municipal sanctions preventing future projects, Thornfield was seeking a negotiated resolution that would minimize legal consequences and continuing reputational damage. The settlement dismantled Thornfield's influence through comprehensive reforms. $2 million funding hospitality workers' education programs, mandatory compliance, monitoring with quarterly federal reporting, affordable housing preservation funding with community notification requirements and public acknowledgement of service industry workers' professional competence and Elena's legitimate compliance concerns. Most personally meaningful was Thornfield's requirement to publicly acknowledge the professional competence and ethical standards of service industry workers, along with specific recognition of Elena's expertise. This represented exactly the dignity restoration she had sought when challenging his public humiliation at Meridian, now backed by federal enforcement authority. The settlement included Elena's employee identification badge from Meridian, which Thornfield's attorneys had retrieved and returned as symbolic acknowledgement of the dignity his public humiliation had attempted to deny. The financial penalties eliminated any profit from his regulatory manipulation schemes, while oversight requirements would make future violations immediately detectable. The final settlement signing took place in federal court, with Elena present as both witness to Thornfield's acknowledgement of violations and beneficiary of educational funding that would help other service workers achieve professional advancement without facing retaliation and financial crisis that had characterized her transition. Elena kept the returned badge on her desk beside her compliance reports, sunlight from her 32nd floor window catching its edges each morning. The small plastic rectangle represented more than personal vindication. It symbolized the principle that dignity belonged to work itself, not the circumstances that made it visible to power. Justice required not just individual restoration, but systematic change that protected others from similar abuses, and Elena's investigation had achieved both. The federal courthouse steps felt solid beneath Elena's feet as she descended from the settlement, hearing autumn sunlight casting long shadows across lower Manhattan's granite facades. 6 months had passed since her confrontation with Thornfield at Meridian, and the legal resolution felt less like victory than the restoration of equilibrium. Justice delivered with the precision of good accounting rather than the drama of moral theater. Dr. Ashford walked beside her, consulting his phone for messages from international clients who had followed the case with keen interest. The European business community has been watching this settlement closely, he noted. Your documentation has provided exactly the kind of case study that helps legitimate investors understand both the risks of regulatory shortcuts and the protections available to those who maintain ethical standards. Elena's current position as Director of Ethics Compliance represented not just career advancement, but alignment between her expertise and values in ways that made each day's work feel purposeful. Her responsibilities included developing compliance protocols for international consulting firms and training programs that helped service industry workers transition to professional roles. The educational fund from Thornfield's settlement had already opened paths for 47 restaurant workers, creating opportunities that honored their intelligence and experience. Her office phone displayed 3 messages when she returned. 2 from journalists seeking comment on regulatory reform implications, and 1 from congressional staff inquiring about her availability to provide testimony for upcoming compliance hearings. But the most significant call came from her mother, whose voice carried calm satisfaction Elena associated with problems resolved rather than crises managed. "Your father walked 2 blocks today without his cane," she reported. "His physical therapist says the consistency of his treatment schedule has made all the difference." Elena felt profound gratitude for the security her position provided. Not just salary that covered medical expenses, but professional dignity that allowed her to contribute expertise rather than simply labor. The afternoon brought a scheduled meeting with Marcus, the former floor manager from Meridian, who had requested consultation about implementing ethical service standards at his new restaurant. Elena had agreed despite their complicated history, recognizing that institutional change required cooperation from people willing to advocate for better practices. "Elena, I want to acknowledge that I failed you when Thornfield demanded your termination," Marcus said once they had settled in the conference room. "I understood that your challenge was both courageous and necessary, but I prioritized business relationships over my responsibility to support staff who demonstrated integrity under pressure." Elena appreciated his directness. "What matters now is whether we can develop protocols that protect service workers while maintaining professional standards that responsible customers actually respect." Together, they drafted simple rules that guaranteed respect without fear, clear boundaries around inappropriate customer behavior, and reporting mechanisms that protected staff from retaliation. As their meeting concluded, Marcus presented Elena with a small package containing a framed photograph from Meridian's opening night, showing the entire original staff in the dining room that had later become the scene of both her humiliation and her moral stand. "I wanted you to have this as a reminder that your colleagues always recognized your competence," Marcus said. "Your courage inspired other staff members to speak out about inappropriate behavior, and several have moved to management positions where they can implement the policies we discussed today." The evening brought Elena to her parents' apartment in Queens, where her father was preparing dinner with steady movement that indicated significant recovery. His improvement had coincided with the financial stability her consulting position provided, eliminating stress about medical expenses that had complicated his rehabilitation. "Your mother and I have been discussing how to thank Dr. Ashford for the opportunity he provided when your situation seemed most difficult," her father said as they settled around the dinner table that had witnessed so many worried conversations about medical bills just months earlier. "We understand your success resulted from your own expertise and courage, but we're grateful someone recognized your value when others were unwilling to look beyond the circumstances that had forced you into service work during our health crisis." Elena watched her father's steady hands as he served dinner, noting how his recovery had paralleled her own professional restoration. She considered how her experience represented both individual vindication and systematic change that would protect others facing similar challenges. Dr. Ashford understood that service work requires the same intelligence as consulting, but operates within power structures that make workers more vulnerable to retaliation, she said. "The educational programs funded through the settlement are helping other people make similar transitions that recognize and properly compensate for their expertise. 47 people so far have moved from service roles to professional positions." Their conversation continued late into the evening, touching on the ripple effects of her stand. How other service workers had found courage to report inappropriate behavior, how restaurants were implementing new dignity protocols, how her case had become a reference point for regulatory enforcement agencies dealing with similar corruption patterns. Later that evening, Elena sat at her desk reviewing compliance documentation for the following day's client meetings, the familiar rhythm of analytical work now carrying deeper purpose than it had during her Wall Street years. The returned Meridian badge caught light from her desk lamp beside the framed photograph Marcus had given her. Dual symbols of dignity maintained and community restored. The small plastic rectangle that had once represented economic necessity now symbolized the principle that respect belonged to work itself, regardless of who performed it or who witnessed it. Justice felt like clean air after a storm, carrying the promise of clearer visibility and steadier ground for those who would follow. Individual courage had created systemic reform when supported by proper legal mechanisms, while her career transition had proved that expertise retained value regardless of the circumstances that made it visible to power. The educational fund continued expanding opportunities for others. The compliance protocols were being adopted across the hospitality industry, and federal agencies had strengthened enforcement procedures based on her documentation methods. The badge caught the desk lamp's light as the skyline glowed beyond her window. Manhattan's towers representing both the structures of power and the communities they served. It was proof that dignity, once defended with competence and unwavering principle, could illuminate more than one life and create lasting change that protected others facing their own tests of courage and worth.